Without further ado, we're going to start, and I would like to welcome Max. He is senior cheesemonger at La Fromagerie, absolute legendary cheesemongers in London. Started by Patricia Michelson, who's written many books about cheese. If you get a chance to get hold of those, I have them all and use them and read them, and just fantastic books. If you get a chance to go to one of the shops, I suppose the iconic one is Marylebone, Max, isn't it?
Yeah, so the original's in Highbury. We've got our biggest cheese room in Marylebone, which is quite an amazing place. And then we've got Bloomsbury, which is a really nice spot to visit too. So yeah, and we also deliver.
Yeah, so, and you've got restaurants.
So you have to come and see us to get our cheese, as you found with this board.
Yes, stunning. I'm just loving all those rhymes. If anybody saw it on social media. Well, we've got lots of people from all over the UK, Derbyshire, Yorkshire, Northumberland, Cheshire. Excellent. Okay, Max, so you are spotlighted. I'm going to disappear. And Max is going to tell you all about this evening. Thanks, Max. Brilliant.
Thanks, Tracy. Welcome, everyone. This is quite an exciting topic for me. I think we're going to kind of get through a lot of detail and try and see how this stuff all fits together. So bear with me, ask any questions you like as we go through, or save them through to the end. But ideally, if you have one of the cheese boards that we've sent out, then lucky you, because everything's in great nick. You'll have something that looks a bit like this in front of you. We're not going to do a formal tasting for these cheeses. I'm going to kind of refer to them as we go through. So for goodness sake, don't wait for me to kind of dive in and start eating cheese. Just kind of nibble as we go through. If you can just about hold back a little bit of each one, so that by the time we get on to talking about it, you've got some to taste, all the better, but really don't worry about it too much. So I'm going to share my screen now, because I thought terroir is such a complicated idea, and one that I'm still grappling with, to be honest. And I think most food writers and winemakers, cheesemakers and sellers, especially British ones, people outside of France and Italy for the most part, are still getting an understanding of what it actually is. And I think that the definition itself is still completely in flux. So rather than just sort of talk at you, which I'm going to do anyway, I'm afraid, I'm going to show some of it visually, because I think understanding how it all fits together is really fascinating and instructive. And I don't expect for a second for you to agree with every single thing I say this evening. In fact, I'd prefer if you didn't. It's more to kind of get a conversation started and start thinking about maybe some aspects of terroir and cheese that maybe you might not have thought about before, or if you have, it'll kind of reinforce that notion that you've had. So that's kind of how we're going to go through stuff. So I'm going to share my screen now. Bear with me just a sec. And then share. So hopefully you should be able to see everything. Tracy, let me know if you can't, but I think that's working.
It's all good, Max, all perfect.
So this is what we're going to explore, terroir, this really strange, untranslatable word. I've tried many a time to try and translate it. My favorite is tasty placeness, but I don't think that's going to fly. So I'm going to have a kind of rough translation for now, which is intentional placeness, and we'll go through that. But really, this whole project, thinking about terroir, was started off in an amazing book, which I encourage everyone who hasn't read it to read it as soon as possible. If you're even vaguely interested in cheese, it's quite exhilarating to think and talk about cheese in the way that this book does. And that is the following: is Bronwyn and Francis Percival's Reinventing the Wheel. And so they have a passage in there which is about the best bit of writing on terroir and cheese in general that I've come across. It's so nuanced and precise and concise at the same time, which, as Tracy mentioned, I struggle with a bit, so I'm even more in awe of it. But I want to kind of read it to you because if you hadn't read this paragraph, you might think that terroir was a wine term that started off in the mid-20th century. That was basically something about soil and something about weather and something about altitude and topology, and it affects grapes in a strange way, which means that fundamentally, if you plant a Sauvignon Blanc grape in one place and then plant another one 10 miles away, and grow the grapes in almost an identical way, and then make a wine in an almost identical way, they taste different. And it's got something to do with the land, and terroir is pretty much directly translated as the French for land. Job done. It's the effect the land has on wine. With cheese, for me, it's even more complicated and mysterious and interesting and connected to the land than even with wine. I think personally that cheese is a much better case for terroir than wine is even. So we're going to run through this quickly, their definition. And I've italicized these words because those are the things that really prick my ears up. When cheese is made with milk that has been farmed with intention, and when that milk's character is magnified rather than obscured by the cheese-making process, the final product's unique flavors take on deeper meaning. They connect us to centuries of history and faraway places, to the ecosystems of small farms, and to communities of plants, animals, microbes, and people living in balance with one another in the environment. The integrity of the system is made manifest in the flavors that can be achieved in no other way. So that's pretty amazing. It's essentially suggesting that there's way more going on than just the soil or the weather on a particular day. And all of that gets reduced into a block of cheese that when you eat it, the flavors that you're tasting, sometimes, frustratingly rarely, the flavors that you're tasting are only due to the place that that milk has been fermented and then made and aged in. Which, if it's true, and that's a big question, is it true? If it's true, that's magic, basically. If you think about the Doomsday Book or even an ice column, they can tell you all sorts of things about a region, the human history of it or the natural history, but none of them taste particularly good. If that information can rise to the surface in the form of flavors, then that's the kind of history I'm interested in. So we're going to try and break this apart a little bit. So I'm kind of swept away some of the stuff in that paragraph and left myself with the words that I'm actually interested in. So obviously place is the most crucial thing. It's a system, it's clearly a wider thing. Intention is involved. So that's a bit odd because we talk about terroir in terms of microbes, soil, milk, fermentation, not so much in terms of decisions or ways of thinking. Meaning's the same ballpark. How does that fit in? Unique flavors, because it can't just taste nice, and those flavors can't arrive by some other means, like they do in Cathedral City, for example. That's amazing that a set of commercial scientists have managed to make cheddar taste a bit like a Solero lolly. I've got all the respect in the world for that, but it's certainly not terroir. And then the milk's character and whether we magnify it or obscure it. So just as a heads up, one of the ways I'm going to depart, as much as I love their definition, and I do, one of the ways that I'm going to depart from the definition is I'm going to question the milk's character's primacy. I think it's not the only thing that we can say about place, but we'll come to that later. So the questions I have, at least, and we're not going to get through them all today, but I'm going to try and give you as big a picture and as a complex a picture as I can in the time that I've got, is what is terroir? And involved in that question always is what isn't it? Because if terroir is whatever you want it to be, and you can apply it to any cheese if you manipulate the language well enough, then it's not a useful concept whatsoever, and we can dispense with it. Slightly tied to that is, why should we care about it? That's always the point for me when I'm thinking about cheese, when I'm thinking about the facts of the farming and the cheese making process and the aging. Not all facts are created equal. Something turns on some variables and other variables are pretty arbitrary and uninteresting. So, why is always a bigger question for me, a much more important question than what. Can the definition change, and has it? Yes and yes in a nutshell. Is it just about the milk? No, in a nutshell. Is it subjective, objective, or both? Yeah, the question gives a clue to the answer. I think it's both. What's the role of intention? That's a weird one, so we'll cover that. And is it something discovered? Because I was having a chat with somebody the other day, a colleague, and they were like, well, you don't create terroir, you find it. And I think that's the general view on it. And that's what I've always thought. But I'm beginning to think that it's something created just as much as it is discovered. Regardless of whether it's discovered or created, how might we foster it? And then that involves another implicit question, which is really important, and that's what obstructs it. So if we think that terroir cheese is important, in fact, the most important kind of cheese, and we want to sell cheeses that have it and make cheeses that have it, we better know what gets in the way of it. And I think that's obviously quite clear in a few cases. And the more that sellers and makers and consumers understand what gets in the way of terroir, the more intelligent decisions they can make about what cheese they put their dollars behind, if that makes sense. So that's the kind of the area for discussion. So the biggest question for me about terroir, and I think that an even bigger question it answers than what is terroir, is this existential crisis that cheese is having in the 21st century. There's a lot of people out there, whether we like it or not, that are asking this question: should we make cheese at all in the 21st century? It's a big question that's facing our industry, and luckily lots of people are trying to answer it in different ways. So the three existential battles that cheese is fighting for me are man-made climate change and the environment in general, and that splits up into climate change, wildlife and biodiversity. What effect does the whole dairy industry have on these things? And should we see the whole dairy industry as a monolith? Some small producers actually might be positive in those regards. Animal welfare does what it says on the tin, and the war against naturally occurring and or local microbes. So the reason I put that in parentheses is that it's not a war against microbes full stop. That's a misunderstanding, because of course even Cathedral City requires a commercial starter culture. It requires microbes. It's just that food safety is very blunt and generalized and treats all naturally occurring or local microbes as basically hostile or irrelevant. So it's just easier for everyone concerned if we do away with them, either limit their activity as much as humanly possible or kill them wherever possible. And that makes itself known right the way through the farming system, through cheese making and aging, all the way to selling. So it's a really big issue. So cheese with terroir is, for me, it's de facto good for the environment and animal welfare. So there's cheeses that are good in that regards that don't have terroir, but for me, nearly all terroir is good in those regards, in those three ways. And secondly, quite separately to that, cheese with terroir is meaningful to the extent that it's worth making for its own sake. So terroir, bringing out terroir with cheese or experiencing terroir with cheese is so important in so many seriously meaningful ways that it's worth doing for its own sake. So examples, meaning, this is all a bit flowery and subjective, Max. Like, what do you mean by meaning? Meaning could be anything. So let's get into this. So the first kinds of meaning that you can have are profit, efficiency, which is a big thing in this country in the 19th century with cheese, esteem for the cheesemaker or seller, so someone like me who sells cheese, deliciousness per se, so does it taste good for whatever reason, the skill of the maker or affiner, artistry, is it good for a nation's artisan cheese industry, so is it good for me and my mates? These are all, they're not to be sniffed at. Then a cheese can be meaningful in terms of the culture of a place that it's made, its history, aesthetic. So that's a really weird thing to attach to cheese in this country, this kind of empiricist, buttoned up, food is just fuel nation that we've been for a very long time, up until the last 50 years. But does cheese interact in any way with notions of beauty? Well, it certainly does in the great cheese nations of the past. So that's a part of it. Identity, is this cheese who I am? And we're going to try Beaufort in a bit. And you better believe that this cheese is who quite a few people in the Savoie consider themselves to be. So that's pretty big. And obviously that all comes together in terms of tradition. We are very interested in a very Western way about traditions in indigenous communities around the world. And for me, the community that's stuck up at high altitude in the Savoie and has been making a Beaufort or a cheese like it for a couple of millennia at least, and see themselves in this cheese, and it's a really strange and wonderful process to arrive at it. It's taken all this time. That's every bit as interesting to me as any piece of indigenous culture around the world. So yeah, that's pretty important. And then obviously animal welfare, maintenance of biodiversity, building biodiversity, wild pasture, and being green. So terroir is kind of a combination of many of the above. A cheese with terroir can have all of the above, and some other important ingredients. But what I'm trying to get across here is that certain kinds of meaning when it comes to cheese, this cheese is meaningful, matter. They just simply matter more than others. So it follows that we should care about and therefore protect some meaningful pursuits, some cheese recipes, some cheesemakers, some cheeses more than others. That is maybe not a popular opinion when you're thinking about a whole nation's artisan cheese industry, because you're trying to support everyone and cheerlead everyone. But if we're worried about terroir, and terroir is as meaningful as I say it is, then you know there's an area in which we should be quite discerning about this also. And lots of people are, thankfully, and that's why the cheese industry in this country and in America are in such amazing shape and seem to be spiraling upwards, whereas in other countries, unfortunately, it seems to be going the other way. So this is all pretty relevant and timely, I think. So the preliminary conclusions are that, like, I'm not saying that cheese has to have terroir in order to be meaningfully meaningful. It's just perhaps the most holistically meaningful cheese a person or a culture or a cooperative can produce. It's simply the ultimate dairy with a point. And in the 21st century, you better be able to show that the dairy that you're making has a point. So it's the ultimate and perhaps crucial component of the artisan industry's reason for being in the 21st century. So that's why terroir is interesting, apart from anything else. And it's interesting for a hell of a lot of other reasons too. So a couple of things to bear in mind as we go through this, right? The steps of producing the raw material and making cheese. So we now understand farming in a much more fine-grained way than we did. So again, the Percivals come to the rescue here. And they basically describe things in the following way. We now understand the integrated farming systems of the past, so self-sufficient farming systems up mountains often, that produced the great terroir cheeses of the past. These farmers were not only farming the ultimate raw material for cheese, but they were also farming microbes. So much so that I was actually on a call with a Swiss pharmacist a while ago doing some cheese training, and he mentioned that in the 70s and early 80s, when the big microbiological labs got going and pharmaceutical labs in Switzerland, they actually recruited cheese makers and farmers to help them grow microbes, because they'd had pretty much a couple of millennia to get it down, even though they had absolutely no idea about germ theory. They just knew that through trial and error that this produced the best possible cheese. So really, farmers and cheesemakers are farming and looking after microbes. So we're going to talk about this in a bit, but the way to think about this conceptually is that there's an unfathomable amount of variables, from the biodiversity of the plants that the cows are grazing on, for example, the microbes that are, and microflora and fauna that are blowing about on the air and end up on the outside of the cow, on the outside of the teat, and then make it into the raw milk. But also the ends of causal chains that start off in what was the place that you're making this cheese doing 150 million years ago. What is the local culture? How is it affected, and therefore the farming affected, by religion, and even the relationship between men and women? These all, in really strange but demonstrable ways, affect the milk. It's like all of the variables of a place leave a fingerprint on the milk. Now, the point is that when you try that milk, it tastes just as bland, to be honest, as any other milk produced anywhere else on the planet. It might be a little bit different, but people shout about the differences between milk types a bit too much, in my view. But in very rare cases, this data, and that's why I want to think about milk as storing data, this data rises up to the surface through long iterative fermentation in the form of flavors that you can taste. And so suddenly you are tasting all of those unfathomable variables that make up a place like this. So again, pretty magical. So the cheese making process, this is something to bear in mind, is just the beginning of iterative fermentation. For me, cheese making starts off when you add the starter culture to the milk and ends when you open the cheese, cut a piece off and put a piece in your gob. Because as long as it's still fermenting right up until the point at which or changing even just because of physical and chemical reactions, up until the point at which you break open the wheel, that's part of the long iterative fermentation process. So the usual narrative, I think, when people are thinking about cheese making is they think of the starter culture as basically disappearing for all intents and purposes as soon as you add the rennet. And as AOC has helped us understand, the starter culture and the microbes in the milk have a massive effect further down the line. So, okay. And so this is the other thing I want you to bear in mind, is that aging is the continuation of that iterative fermentation. And it's also an opportunity to introduce place. So this is actually Tom de Savoie on racks in Cave de Savoie, exactly where our Beaufort has been aged also. And you can see the stickiness of that wall. I actually didn't manage to get a photo, unfortunately, and I can't find one, presumably because they don't want to get shut down by the authorities, where pretty much a Beaufort like this, it would have been exactly this, because this is where this Beaufort has come from, was sitting on an unwashed spruce wooden board in a cave dripping with moisture, covered in mold. And the blue cheese had got, the Beaufort, the hard cooked cheese, had essentially gone from its washed rind to billowy, fluffy molds. It looked like a sheep compressed into the shape of a cheese. So you better believe that local microbes and the place are asserting themselves on the flavor of the cheese long after the cheese has been made. When it's in these caves in the Savoie, it's still the region asserting itself on the cheese. So yeah, aging is super important when it comes to terroir. It's not just about the milk. Okay, so I thought we'd nip back to this just for a second, because I really like this definition, even though I'm going to criticize it a little bit. This is in the Oxford Companion to Cheese. So to sum it up, they reckon it's a geographical space with a combination of environmental properties. And also they kind of bring in history a bit because of the technical cheese making practices that developed over time. These factors are said to give particular characteristics to food, particularly fermented food, because that's the best way of it coming through, conferring the taste of their terroir. So they are basically thinking about terroir as something that exists, and then you either let it come through in the cheese or you get in the way of it. And I think that that's not necessarily the most helpful way of thinking about terroir. And I'm going to show how I think it all fits together in the best way of defining and thinking about terroir from this point in. So, so in a nutshell, I don't actually care when during the whole process that leads up to me eating the piece of the cheese that the place makes itself apparent, right? It's not just about the character of the milk. It simply matters that the flavor I'm tasting is the product of that place and can be produced in no other way. So milk is important, but so is the starter culture, the cheese making processes, and even the microbes in, say, a cave. All are ingredients or components of terroir, not vectors for it. We better think of the place being the thing that we're tasting, and then these variables being vectors for the place, and then the event, you know, eating the cheese as the moment terroir springs into being as a mental event. So that's all a little bit complicated. So I'm going to try and make it a bit simpler. Because I think many of you that that obviously know a bit about terroir already and have your own understanding of it, you might be thinking, oh, give me a break, mate. Look, all of this is pretty highfalutin, but it's pretty straightforward, actually. Either the aromatic compounds in the cheese are caused by the plant the animals graze on and the microbes that end up on its teat or whatever, or they're not. Done. Everything else is just distraction and irrelevant, especially meaning and intention. I mean, what's all that about? So I'm going to try and convince you. Okay. So the whole point of terroir is specifically that you're tasting a place. So it's not simply like, oh goodness, this is such a regional cheese, like the Crottin, for example. This is such a regional cheese. I think about the local culture there and the rolling hills of the Loire Valley and goats grazing in the springtime, and I eat the cheese, so it's got terroir. It's less like pointing at an artwork and saying this is art. It's a lot more objective than that. So let's get into it. So simply, we can agree, I think, if we're going to, you know, take for argument's sake here, if you're going to give me my argument the best shake, I think we can all agree that a place is made up of two main factors. It's natural history, so everything that's happened in the last, you know, conservatively 100 million years. And then human history, everything that's happened in the last, you know, up to 10,000 years, insofar as they affect that place, right? And the way that that breaks down is that you've got, if you can see my cursor, you've got the natural history components, the kind of abstract ones. What's the bedrock like? And that results in the soil. What does the landscape look like? The elevation, the altitude, the topography in general. Natural selection, obviously that environment affects what grows there, how it grows there, how it changes, and then climate. And then the human aspects of it that you might think, oh, what the hell has this got to do with cheese? War, religion, gender, economics, psychology, class. I mean, class is a massive thing in wine and cheese, in its development, in its appreciation. The trade of physical resources. Again, I'm going to go back to the Beaufort. You might be getting the idea that this is a pretty important cheese to me. It's made in copper vats. That copper had to come from somewhere. And the trade of ideas. So in a nutshell, Etruscans, Greeks, Romans export the cheese making technology as we know it, the use of rennet around Europe. And the whole of the north of Europe has its long fermenting, firm cheeses redolent with terroir to thank for that trade of ideas. So let's eat a piece of cheese quickly. Gender, right? We're going to come to that just now. But first of all, so make sure you're digging into your Crottin de Chavignol. It's important to realize that places aren't islands. So British cheese making, its tradition, it's not an island for all intents and purposes. Neither is the Savoie or any part of the Alps. Obviously, these ideas come from elsewhere. Through war, through changes of religion, and they have a massive effect on the landscape. Of course they do, how it's farmed. The big moment in English civilization, or I should say the civilization of the British Isles, was us cutting down all of the forest that was covering our landscape and replacing it with farmland. It was along with coffee, at least according to Michael Pollan, along with coffee, that started the dominance of the Western world, pretty much, the Enlightenment. So yeah, it's pretty interrelated, this stuff. So let's see how it all goes. So the natural world has, we're going to go from general natural world to specific aspects of the natural world. So that all comes to weather, what plants grow there, wildlife, as well as the dairy animals, fungi, viruses. Obviously, we know that has effect on a place all too well. And then microbes blowing about in the air everywhere that's relevant to cheese. I mean, you can't overstate their importance. And obviously that has an effect on what farming system you choose. Species and breed. 1,000 years ago, they weren't thinking, oh, I wonder if I'm going to do a market survey as to see whether people prefer cow or sheep's milk and whether they prefer this breed or that breed. It was, I've got a tricky piece of land. What animal's not either going to starve or break its neck? That's the one I'm going to choose. And so you have these local breeds that are attuned, adapted to where they're grazed. Cheese recipes, obviously, in the Loire Valley with the Crottin de Chavignol, you've got temperate climate all year round, and so you don't need, like you are in the Alps, to put down a cheese so you don't starve in the winter. So soft cheese is the way to go. Gender, for example, in the whole of the Loire Valley, particularly in Sancerre where this is made, men made wine, women made cheese. They, as often men are allowed to do, were concentrating on one thing all day. Their wives had 1,000 other tasks to do on top of cheese making. So they chose lactic fermentation, a slow set curve that took 2 days to make usually, so they could periodically come back to it, do the washing, do some other farming, raise the children. And you end up with these amazing lemony flavors as a result. Those flavors are a result of that gender politics, or that gender divide in jobs and resources and pressures. You're tasting that aspect of the place more than you are even the bedrock, I would say. So the Crottin de Chavignol, not only when it's young, it's just lemony, so I wouldn't describe it as having terroir at that age, but this age, when it's getting these beautiful blue molds around the outside, that's when these microbes are coming into play. The cheese recipes coming into play, everything around it is coming together to produce this complex, spicy, lemony, nutty flavor that you're getting in this cheese. And it's all right, isn't it? It's pretty good, pretty amazing. And of course, you can see that this is an absolute web of influence. So it's a system. So that's what Bronwyn and Francis Percival are talking about. All of these factors that you would never think about are all affecting each other. So this all ends up with your raw material, your milk. So the milk needs to be thought of in two ways. You've got its physical constitution. So depending on the breed and what it's been eating, that's going to tell you the size of the fat globules. It's going to tell you the ratio of protein to fat, to sugar, to lactose, to water. It's going to tell you all those things. The chemical constitution. Saint-Nectaire, one of the big things that produces flavor in Saint-Nectaire is nothing to do with microbes or fermentation. It's to do with the fact that this tiny AOC or PDO area is replete with weird volcanic soil growing herbs and flowers, things like licorice and gentian and yarrow, that all make it into the milk via aromatic compounds that the animal digests and makes it into the milk ducts and into the milk. So the chemical constitution of the milk is really important. It's not all about microbes, but the original microbial constitution is probably the most important bit. So this is the bit where I'm going to disagree with very respectfully with the Percivals. In fact, Bronwyn Percival helped edit this amazing book called The Microbiology of Raw Milk. It's from a research body in France. It's pretty incredible. And I read through it and I took a couple of big takeaways from it, basically. These are the central claims of making artisan raw milk in an informed way. And for me, I'm going to use the case of natural wine so I don't annoy anyone within the cheese industry, because I think it applies to wine just as much as it does to cheese. So there's a strong connection between the microbial ecosystems in milk and certain product traits like texture, color, and flavor, right? But only if the technical processes chosen respect those original microbial communities. So far, we're agreeing with Bronwyn here. But it's not as simple as the presence of one species of microbe or another. Its origin, its quantity, or even diversity in general. It's the equilibrium of the microbial community during fermentation, during cheese making, or the power relationship between microbes that has the biggest effect on how easy it is to make, how it looks, smells, and tastes, and whether it's going to kill you or not, basically. So put another way, the traditional quality determinants like climate, season, pasture, milk treatment, the ecosystem of the microbes in the dairies, or even the milking parlor, they create or add to an original balance of microbes, right? That's one step. You can't make terroir cheese without that, but you need to remember that that can be affected, either maintained, altered, improved, degraded by the equipment and processes that dairy farmers and cheesemakers, and agers for that matter, select and implement. So what do I mean here? Can you see that all of these things that I've been talking about a region, they obviously affect the raw material, but that has to go through, that's just an intermediary step. That has to go through this middle stage where the microbial constitution of the cheese, once it's made into curds and put in a mold, during that long, slow fermentation is changing constantly. And also the chemical constitution and physical constitution of the cheese is changing constantly. So, and that's not just affected. So this is the key thing. That's not just affected by the raw material. The cheese making process and aging process can be affected by things like weather, local microbes, the farming system chosen, obviously the cheese recipe chosen, how that affects. So obviously Catholic monks make cheese in a very different way to Protestant farmers. Always have done for different reasons. This is all interrelated, and this affects the cheese making process and then therefore the final cheese just as much as the character of the milk, right? So so in kind of philosophical terms, the character of the milk, this section here, is an instrumental good, not a final good. And I think that basically cheese sellers and lovers and makers are led astray when they think of the milk being the only important thing. And most don't, okay, most don't, but sometimes it's something that we need to get our head around. And all of this counts for absolutely nothing, obviously, unless you eat a piece of cheese at the end of all of it. So once you've got to the end of this stage, you've made this without messing anything up, and it really is a reflection of everything that's happened before it. And you've got it and fermented it again without messing anything up. And it's, you know, the final piece of cheese is affected by everything that's come before it. Eating a piece of cheese, you're not a computer. You're not shoving a piece of cheese into a spectral analysis chamber and it's telling you what compounds are in it. And you can tell whether it's come from the place or come from a sachet of commercial starter culture somebody's bought from Germany on Amazon. Flavor is not a property of the cheese. It's a mental event. So it's a complex sequence of events that starts off with perception. So those aromatic compounds making it into receptors on your nose and soft palate, and then sending electrical signals to your brain. But then that gets mixed in this subjective cocktail with your perception, more generally, your memory, and the meaning that you associate with cheese. So is cheese just like, are you sticking a piece of Beaufort, you know, or Saint-Nectaire for that matter, on a salad, or are you treating it like communion? That's a massive thing. So just try and bear in mind quite how subjective the process of eating a piece of cheese is. But nonetheless, this is where the Percival's answer back. It still has to result in flavor that can be achieved in no other way. So if for whatever reason the stars don't align for all of this process behind it to produce unique flavors that specifically can't be achieved in any other way, then the cheese might still have all sorts of meaning attached to all of this stuff, but it doesn't have terroir, right? So that's crazy. So it's something that's both objective and subjective at the same time. If I say this Salers has terroir, I'm either making a true statement or as a false statement as a result. Something a lot of people think you can't say about literature or art, but you can say about this complex and interesting and beautiful cultural artifact, which is Salers. Tradition in this case, made from one herd, one breed of Salers cow, aged in gerle, these unwashed wooden vats, milked in the field because they're too smart to be shoved into a milking parlour, and then made in a way that stretches back 2,000 years. We think that a precursor to Cellairs, along with Beaufort, if you read Ned Palmer's amazing book about British cheese, the first hard cheeses to make it into the British Isles with the invasion of the Romans. This is history that you can taste. So it also implies, and this is a bit of a dodgy one for cheese sellers and cheese lovers, that the same cheese, not just the same producer wheel to wheel, but the same cheese can have terroir one day, and then if you mess up the affinage or it's just not working for you, lose it the other day. It's just, an époisse can go from ethereal and complex to tasting like poo and ammonia. And at that point, the flavor you can create the flavors of poo and ammonia in any cheese anywhere in the world. That's not terroir. So yeah, it's a fleeting thing. It's inconsistent. And even on this cheese board right now, even though all of these recipes I think are conducive to terroir, maybe not all of them are going to be showing it today. And that's just a inconvenient but slightly magical reality of buying and selling cheese, basically. So, as I said before, don't get hung up on the original microbial constitution. It doesn't go anywhere towards terroir in and of itself. It has to go through that next step. So this is the mistake that a lot of, not all natural winemakers make, but a lot do, which is that they get this incredible microbially diverse grape juice, and they're like, job done, terroir wine, I can let it ferment anyhow. And then it tastes kind of like cider or kombucha or farmyard. And this step here has been completely poorly controlled, because then there might be, people that look like me that have moved from Paris into the countryside and some ability to get some desire to get back to nature, and are making this cidery wine that's perfectly tasty. But all of those flavors can be achieved anywhere on the planet, mate. And regardless of your original microbial balance, you haven't got this step right. So that's why I kind of want to draw this distinction and make you, or help everyone understand that, it's a system. Everything has to be working together. So how does this happen? How do you actually take milk, which is quite bland, and get a set of flavors that can be achieved in no other way? So this is not scientific. This is more conceptual. I like to think of it as a fermentation corridor. So within this corridor, if you get an unbelievably skillful cheesemaker, usually, but not always, a cheesemaker that's at the end of many generations of cheesemakers that have been really nailing this in for a while through trial and error, if they can keep the cheese throughout the whole fermentation process, from curd production through curd concentration, the final product of the cheese, and then aging, if they can keep it between these two middle black lines, that's where the magic happens. Because if you just make a cheese with amazing milk, but you're quite cautious with the fermentation, you end up with generic dairy flavors. So benign dairy flavors, I would say, things like cheesy flavors, cooked milk, yogurt, milk, just lactic acidity and nothing else, right? It doesn't mean it's not delicious. It doesn't mean it's not meaningful, but it doesn't qualify as terroir for the reasons given. And then if you let it get out of control, either during the cheese making process, or people like me who do a bit of affinage and just let something go too far, then you get generic off flavors, ammonia, farmyard, vinegar. You might actually find a lot of these flavors in the Cellairs, for example, today. Acrid flavors, burnt flavors. I find Conte, when it's aged too far and that wheel can't take it, can taste very, very burnt indeed. And that's the only flavor I can taste. And then in the middle, this is where alchemy happens. It's transformation flavors. Basically, long fatty acid chains in milk and long protein molecules get snipped by enzymes from microbes, or just by degradation over time, into these delicate volatile aromatic compounds. And suddenly you'll end up with the same ester you'd find in a pineapple, which nobody obviously 2,000 years ago up the Alps had ever tasted before, but they tasted the first pineapple through fermentation. So when you have these flavor wheels that involve For example, some of the Fontina d'Alpina that's made over 2,800 meters undeniably tastes of olives when it's on song. That's magic. And so obviously you can get these flavors through ways that don't involve the place, just through choosing a good commercial starter culture like Helveticus, which is why Cornish quartz tastes like a Solero lolly. But when you both do this alchemy, this magic, and that magic is exclusively and inextricably linked to the place where that's made, that's when terroir occurs. So a lot of cheeses fit in one of these three circles. So the blue circle is the one I talked about. The Beaufort today, at least that, I think also the Crottin, and to an extent the Saint-Nectaire, sit in this green circle. So they can have some of those generic flavors either end, but they've got a lot of flavors in the middle that are unique and are due to that place. And then the same cheese or just another cheese from that batch or from another producer or from somewhere else can taste mostly of this. And again, that might be interesting. You might like it. It's not a value judgment. It just doesn't, in my mind, qualify for terroir for the reasons given. So does that hopefully that makes sense. I know that we're whizzing through this quite quickly, but I want to make sure that we get to the end of this. So yeah, if you have any questions at the end, I'll do my best to answer them. So what are these flavors? Volatile aromatic compounds. What makes them? So we've covered this a little bit. The plants the animal is eating. In the case of the Saint-Nectaire, those delicate herbal flavors, perhaps those notes of cob nut. Sometimes this cheese can taste a little mentholy or cucumbery. Sometimes the rind can taste of pea shoots and earth. That's a combination of the plants the animals are grazing on, the microbes that end up on the outside of the animal, but also in the aging facility in the caves on the wooden boards. And the physical processes that happen in the cheese as it ages. It dehydrates, certain molecules just degrade by themselves with nothing doing anything to them. But what's the mechanism happening in fermentation? So it's enzymes, actually. The microbes don't just kind of wave a wand. They release an enzyme which snips large molecules into smaller ones. The smaller they get, the more volatile they get, and often you can smell them. So therefore, what is the main mechanism or engine of terroir? It's the controlled activity of local microbes. So this is the thing I was harping on about earlier. Local microbes are all well and good, and if you are not controlling them through years and generations of experience or just bloody good cheese making, then it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. So it's the controlled activity of local microbes. That's what produces terroir. So local microbes aren't bought in a sachet of commercial starter culture from Germany. They're made in a bucket or in a lab from local strains, right? So in a nutshell, just to reiterate this, whatever process produces these flavors is both the machinery of how a place exerts itself on a cheese to produce terroir, but also the mechanism by which the place can be blocked or shouted down. So these processes are both your saviors and your murderers when it comes to producing terroir. So that's why it's so fraught and so difficult, and why even the same amazing producer raffineur won't nail it with every single wheel of cheese. As I said earlier, terroir isn't just an end in and of itself, although it is. It's also a way that we eat a piece of cheese and imbue it with some meaning. So when we take a mouthful of cheese, sometimes some people will think this has terroir, or this is beautiful. So that's what aesthetics is about. This is beautiful. This has meaning. This is who I am. And if you're skeptical about that, one of my formative experiences was going to the Savoie and seeing quite a lot of pretty butch French cheesemongers eat a piece of Beaufort, and another great terroir product of the region, which I've got an old bottle of here, Vin Jaune, have them together, and they were all welling up. That level of meaning, if your grandma used to make halloumi or mozzarella, that sense of identity when you're eating a cheese, the emotion that swells up and the way you engage with the flavors is obviously massive in the event of experiencing terroir. So eating that piece of cheese, the mental states you bring to it are really affected by the local culture. It took us to have people like Keith Floyd, but also aristocrats hundreds of years ago, to convince us that food itself was meaningful, that it was a cultural product. Brits only ever really applied that to art and literature and music. We didn't do that with food, but the French did. It was a French table thing to sit and think about what this wine or this cheese means. The French have always thought of wine as an intellectual pursuit, and it's a way of thinking that's connected to their religion, their economics, trade. You know, that France had an even more important role for the Romans, who exported wine than Britain did, and you could grow it there. But also their landscape, the fact that they've got Provence in the south. It's, you know, it's easy to put your feet up and contemplate the mysteries of wine and cheese if you're next to a beach, you know. So it's all of these things are involved. But however, despite the fact that flavor is subjective, the compounds themselves that you're tasting themselves and their origin is fully objective. So it's this weird mix of the two. And obviously, the place exerts itself in your experience of the cheese in terms of what you think terroir means. Like, what do you think about? What's the experience you're having? People think that, you know, art used to be great and now it's rubbish. But every stage in history, the first Turner painting, for example, people thought was a load of rubbish. It was just meaningless to them because they didn't have the visual vocabulary to understand what it meant and to feel something when they saw it. It's exactly the same. Brits have only just started, and that's not just true of Brits, it's true of Germans, it's true of a lot of ex-Protestant countries. Sweden is a really good example that has all of the features of bloody the Alps, and you think it had been making terroir cheese forever, but it took until the 19th century for a Swede to go to the Alps, see what was possible in a landscape that looked very like the landscape he had in his back garden, and then for him to go back and stop making cheese that was historically known as only good for making shields with and was worm infested. So yeah, the culture in the region, the way of thinking absolutely affects this. And of course, that feeds back. So it's actually a cycle. The system of terroir cheese is actually a feedback loop. So once you start thinking about cheese in this way, because the first people that made Beaufort, for example, this nutty, elegant, floral, fruity, complex cheese, they weren't making it to create art. They were making it to survive a 6 months snowed in. You don't want your children to die. But once they dialed in the recipe and started tasting this complexity, they saw cheese differently, and it changed their culture and their identity fully, which then fed back into how they farmed the animals. So suddenly you have a cheese that is protected, Beaufort Chalet d'Alpage, where you can only make it above 1,500 meters with one herd of animals grazing between May and October, by law. And so that way of seeing has affected the law as well as the farming processes, how you make the milk, therefore the original constitution of the milk, how the raw material looks, how it's made, which affects how you eat it, which affects the flavor that can be achieved in no other way, your experience of terroir, and then it feeds back. And so you can see how in a region like the Savoie, this positive feedback loop spiraled upwards over the course of about 3,000 years to the point where you have as close as it gets to a cheese god, basically, in Beaufort Chalet d'Alpage, something that should be revered as such. And you can see how now in France and Italy, with people not understanding this process, mistrusting microbes, making tweaks to their farming system, cheese making processes in order to fulfill other intentions like efficiency and profit, how this can act as a negative feedback loop. Cheese becomes less meaningful, the culture changes, therefore people farm differently and make cheese differently, and suddenly you have a spiraling downwards feedback loop. And so this is what I want to kind of get across, particularly to the British cheese industry, is that this is all connected. And cheese sellers have a massive part in getting this idea across. We can talk about meaning And then that can feed back, and hopefully that affects our cheese industry and makes it go towards terroir rather than away from it, if that makes sense. So some questions near the end of this, because we're coming to the end. When you're thinking about terroir, think about the things that you normally think about, like the land and the animals and the microbe, but also think about who is making the cheese and why are they making it. So are they using this particular technique or that particular technique to bring out the character of the place, or are they doing it for some other reason, like it just tastes a bit better or it's an easier way of doing it? So some cheesemaking processes and farming processes are more interesting and important than others as a result. Who's eating the cheese and why are they eating it? It's really easy to experience terroir if you're deep in that culture and that cheese already comes imbued with meaning when you try it. As new cheese lovers and people that live in cities and people that are disconnected from this stuff, as we all are from cheese, because it's just a confected product wrapped up in a box and put on a shelf, then it's harder to see the terroir. And then how does it taste? Why does it taste that way? Is that because of the place or for some other region? And yeah, some claims I've already made. So this is the bit I want to kind of really whiz through, but the key objective aspect of this is how do you magnify or obscure the place, not necessarily just the character of the milk, but the place. So we shouldn't exclusively worry about magnifying or obscuring the milk's character. It's just one vector for the place, although a pretty important one. We should think more broadly about whether we are magnifying or obscuring the place throughout farming, cheesemaking, and aging. So what features and processes of farming, cheesemaking, and aging magnify or obscure the place? So this is just, a very rough sketch, but in farming, you can magnify it through pasture feeding, local breeds, milk from a single herd. So they're actually really showing fine-grained differences from season to season and from pasture to pasture. Teat cleaning, are you getting rid of all the microbes on the outside of the animal with disinfectant, or are you allowing the good ones to remain? And then you categorically get in the way of terroir if you supplement the feed with beets, or you try and even it out during the year, destroy seasonality. If you get milk from too many different herds, if you clean the animal and sterilize everything at every process, then even if you produce raw milk through that process, as we've discovered with Camembert and Normandy, then the microbial count's pretty paltry, even though the milk's technically raw. So yeah, milk treatment, how are we treating the milk? Pretty obvious. Curd production, curd concentration, and aging, which I think of as cheese making as a whole. Most people think it stops before aging, but I don't think it does. Are you using a local starter or a commercial starter? The commercial starter can introduce loads of interesting, delicious flavors, but they are unquestionably shouting down the flavors that are produced in no other way than through that place. And so they are, in no uncertain terms, obscuring or obfuscating terroir. So continuous whey starters, local starters, rennet choice, you name it, that's all involved. Curd concentration, are you being gentle on the curd? So in the case of Beaufort, they heat it to 52 degrees instead of the higher temperatures for other Gruyères and Comtés and the like. And so some of that delicate character, both in terms of the chemical constitution and the microbes, are kind of treated a bit more gently with something like this. So that really counts. And a lot of people think that that's what's so wonderful about British territorials, is that the curd concentration process is actually pretty kind to the microbes in the milk. And then aging. Are you encouraging microbes on the right? Gorwith Caphilia is a really good example, but so is Saint-Nectaire. Looks terrifying to the uninitiated, like it's completely gone off. So does the Crottin de Chavignol, but they're encouraging local microbes, either as part of the starter culture or just in the air on the wooden spruce boards or oak boards in the cave, whatever it might be, to land on the cheese and make themselves known through flavor. And then you can get in the way of that by discouraging microbes on the rind, just spraying on like a commercial brie, spraying on a Penicillium candida, or use of non-local commercial bacteria on the rind, or fungi for that matter. So given all of this, I'm going to make a strange claim. Since you can actually introduce microbes and placeness throughout curd production, curd concentration, aging, you can technically have a cheese that's made with pasteurized milk that has terroir. And we all know that it's all too common for a raw milk cheese to have no terroir. So, you know, ideally you'd want a raw milk cheese, but not all's lost if you do have a pasteurized or a thermized milk cheese. There's still an opportunity for the place to assert itself on the cheese in a way that produces flavor. So some terroir supporting components: farming. Basically, the allowance of seasonality, the allowance of tradition, local breeds and small herds, and traditional animal husbandry where possible. I'm not saying you need all of these features, but as many of these as you can have, you're giving yourself the best possible chance of producing a terroir cheese. Cheese making, local starters, curd concentration methods that are gentle on the milk, fermentation methods like the Crottin, for example, or cooking and pressing cheese, which is a way of doing it really efficiently, so you can lay down as much milk for a hard winter as you possibly can. Fermentation and cheese making methods that are product of generations worth of accrued knowledge and skill. And in the case of the Beaufort, the Chalets, thousands of years. And cheese making techniques that shepherd the milk, sorry for the pun, and curds along that fermentation corridor that I talked about. And then aging, post-make processes that maintain the iterative fermentation processes. In the British Artisan Cheese Awards, I tried a uncooked and pressed, or a crumbly cheddar-style sheep's milk cheese where they wash the rind. Amazing. Well, that's, you know, there's always place for innovation in cheese. That can be just as much a part of terroir as anything else. Everything was an innovation once. Everything came from somewhere else. I don't really care about the fact that we cloth bound cheese in the past, because that might not have been for terroir related reasons. It might just have been for the peculiarities of the Southwest and the fact that it was an easier way of making cheese that didn't have mold on the outside. So anything like that is a real help. Aging environments with local microbes. So this is a controversial one. Maybe it's better to do the affinage in the region than it is to do it elsewhere in a centralized place. And yeah, as I said, post-make processes basically that add local microbes that contribute to flavor. Yeah, there was one, I think I've just, in 1 minute, I just want to show you one last thing that didn't make it onto here. Maybe you can just screenshot this. I won't explain it to everyone, but I've drawn up a little diagram of exactly where microbes come from, whether they're from the environment or manufactured, exactly what effects they have on cheese, through the phases of curd production, curd concentration, and ripening that I talked about. Bear with me a second.
That's better, Max. We can see that better now.
Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you want a kind of, because I know that this has been quite flowery, if you want a bit of more of a kind of scientific understanding of how this all fits together, then this diagram does it for you a bit. You can see where they come from, and you can see roughly the effect that they'll have on cheese for the most part. But the magic, if I just talk about Beaufort for a second before we finish, because I think this really is pretty magical. Let's just play this out, everything I've talked about out, just with one cheese. You've got probably the most biodiverse and interesting pasture anywhere on the planet that's been farmed for millennia by isolated farming communities that have worked on this and almost nothing else. They were, in terms of the fine food and culture world, about as low in class economically, intellectually, culturally as you could possibly get, but they were probably producing the most historically important and culturally relevant and magical and aesthetically important cultural artifact I can think of in Europe. And so this raw milk has a fingerprint on it that takes in swirling magical variables, everything from war to religion to identity to climate. They didn't even know it at the time, but what the soil was doing in the Jurassic period, and then left this data in this milk, which is then farmed and then fermented in a way that's also taken all this time to develop. And so you end up with a wheel of Beaufort that's just been made. But then you're through a starter culture, I should say, that's made in vats with hot and cold water. It's super old school, just unbelievably biodiverse starter cultures that are all based on local microbes, which are then adding their own character to the cheese. You then make the cheese, and then it's a morge cheese. So we describe this in Academy of Cheese as a wash rind cheese. In France, they have this unbelievable process called morge, which is where you essentially get the cheese, you put salt over it, you put these wet rags over the top of the salt, and you never change those rags. Those rags go brown and sludgy and awful. They basically look like a tramp's underpants. But you keep that with the cheese, and it goes in a bucket in some water, and then suddenly you have this bacterial soup, which again is a cocktail of local microbes that wash the cheese repeatedly throughout its life in the caves of Savoie. And so eventually, once that wash rind dries off, you then get this incredible fluffy mold around the outside, which is also adding flavor to the cheese. And what's going on under the rind is that these long protein molecules and fat molecules are snipped in this exponential waterfall. So they're snipped into larger molecules, then smaller ones and smaller ones. And at each stage through the 2 years that this takes to age, roughly, you're getting exponentially more and more aromatic compounds as the process goes on. And a cheesemaker or ager can mess that up at any time, pretty much, until what you're left with is a cheese that contains at least 600 aromatic compounds that the human, pretty rubbish by mammalian standards, perceptual system can pick up on. And so suddenly you realize that everything that I've been talking about, all of the variables of that place, have literally come to the surface in terms of flavor that can be produced in no other way. And that's terroir in a nutshell. And that's why we should care about it, basically. So yeah, that's it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Max. That was fascinating, fascinating, fascinating. Can you turn off your stop sharing screen bit, and then we can just do some quick questions? Yeah, we've got applause here in the chat. The word applause. Thank you, Mike. I think we are all applauding you. It's fantastic.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I realized there was a lot there. So yeah, I'll try and answer any questions if I can.
But that's your brilliant mind. I think that's how you roll, and it's I love the way you present, so it's fantastic, really lovely. Okay, I'll ask you these questions. When's Max bringing a book out on cheese? Claire is saying. Does Max consider there are more or less French cheeses nowadays that he would say have terroir? Are there upward or downward trends in France and other countries with cheeses he would consider have terroir? 1 minute.
Yeah, it's a downwards trend, unfortunately. There's still some PDOs have helped this process. Some of them completely got in the way of it and scuppered it. So in the case of Beaufort and Comté and Saint-Nectaire, still going strong. Salers Tradition still going strong. Crottin de Chavignol, basically the cheeses that I put on this board, and a few others. And then in other cases, Camembert is a perfect example of something that's a shadow of its former self for the most part. And the EU, for all that's a very controversial subject, but they've not necessarily been a good news in this regard.
And then, is there anything special to say about the Roquefort? I mean,
yeah. I mean, it's, well, we know the kind of story of Roquefort about the date, and we know about the kind of rotting bread that's used to start the process off, which is so French and so cool. But basically, Charles VI, this is the terroir depends on a way of seeing cheese as being magical and being tied to the place where it's made, that just doesn't exist outside of France in the same way, even in Italy, I would argue. And even as far back as Charles VI realized that most people think about PDOs and name protection as just originally about fraud protection. And for a lot of people it was, because people's livelihoods were at risk. But the French also realized that there was this magical connection between the place and the fermented products that are produced from it, so wine and cheese. And so yeah, so Roquefort was the very first protected. So it's the OG terroir cheese. It's the first time that people really got on board with the idea that this was something magical and that needed to be protected.
I just love Roquefort, absolutely love it. And I have fresh figs in my garden now, so
yeah, that's going to be amazing.
You've been fantastic. I did ask you one question in the chat, and I asked it to everybody else as well, as to what British cheeses do you think reflect terroir for you? And we had loads of really good suggestions there. St. James, Kirkham's, Lancashire, big time.
I agree. Yeah.
Well, St. James again.
St. James, I think even like that's my standard bearer, I think, in a lot of ways.
Would that be your favourite?
It's one of them, yeah. I think it's if we looked at that whole system, it's doing a lot of those things right. One of the hard things that the Americans are finding is that without 3,000 years of tradition, that's a big chunk of terroir potentially missing, and we've got to show some humility about that. Basically. Yeah. But on the other hand, it's very British for me to think about, to get ideas from other nations and to fold that into the way that we do things. So, you know, Martin Gott is a much more classic British terroirist than the cheddar makers and even the territorial makers of the 19th century for me. We should be looking at what he's doing rather than arbitrarily looking backwards for me.
Yeah. Move forwards. Spill King is also saying Havod as well, which is
totally.
We were up there for the SCA, the Specialist Cheesemakers Day. Were you at that? And the fields, the buttercups, the peas were flowering in the fields, and the cows. That's their food. Amazing.
And also basically anything that Andy Swinscoe is involved with. It's probably, he's like a one-man terroir machine.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Right, we're going to have
changing Yorkshire as one step at a time. So yeah.
Yes, all the heroes. You have been absolutely awesome. Thank you so much for spending time preparing this and spending the time to talk to us all about it. I hope you've enjoyed it too, Max. I think everybody...
there was a little lot. I was really worried about the time, but I'm glad that we
really well. And this is recorded, so we will get that up for all of those that have participated and couldn't watch it all or want to watch it again and digest. And Max is also on our British Cheese Weekender website, talking about, can I remember what you talked about?
It was British cheese, actually, so we're kind of this subject.
So if you want more of Max, people, go to the British Cheese Weekender website, see him there, or he's available at La Fromagerie, and you do loads of tastings as well, don't you, and corporate stuff. So fantastic.
And of course AOC.
Yes, Academy of Cheese. Go study with him. We will be getting there soon. So thank you ever so much, Max. I'm going to close it.
Thanks, Tracy.
And I will send you the comments from the chat as well, so you can see what everybody was saying. But amazing. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. Really appreciate it, and have a lovely evening.
And you.
All right, bye guys.
Bye bye.